My name is Thomas Biersteker. I'm from the Graduate Institute in Geneva, where I teach international relations and political science. I'm also the director of the Center for the Study of International Governance at the Institute and the director of policy research. I have, at the moment, 5 different projects that I'm working on. 2 funded by the Swiss National Science Foundation, one on pedagogy and international relations, another on institutional reform within the UN system and its consequences for the effectiveness of different UN agencies. I also have several projects on international sanctions, one which is looking at the relationship between UN sanctions and UN mediation efforts, and that's likely going to be funded by the Swiss government probably in the next week or so. And also an ongoing project updating sanctions app, which is an app created to make UN sanctions information available to practitioners, particularly practitioners working at the UN in New York. And the 5th project, actually the reason I'm here at the University of Sydney, is a project that I started literally decades ago, a project I started with my former PhD thesis supervisor, Hayward Elker, the late Hayward Elker from MIT. We started this in the 1970s, late 1970s, to start looking at what we called the dialectics of world order when we first started. Now, with revisions about a decade ago, just before Hayward passed away, we changed it to the dialectics of world orders. And I have, we completed 6 of the 7 chapters about 10 years ago, and my goal here over the next few months is to update those 6 and to draft a concluding chapter with the inputs of yourself and your colleagues here at the University of Sydney. So at one level, of course, the events have changed, the interpretations of events have changed, but the conceptual originality of looking at coexisting interpenetrated world orders is, in fact, I think, a very contemporary ontological shift away from states, regions, civilizations, and ways of thinking about the subject of international relations. In that sense, timely. Using what I suppose is the D word, dialectics, a very controversial word, but explaining what we mean by a dialectical orientation is I think, timely, timeless at a certain level. It's not a recent development. It's not a new theoretical trend by any means. We can trace it back several thousands of years in terms of dialectical formulations. So nothing is timeless, but there is a certain element of it that remains very timely. And then at the moment, at least in the last at least decade and a half, maybe 25 years since the end of the Cold War, we've been living in what many of us have characterized as the liberal moment, or the unipolar liberal moment. Now, for the first time, we're facing serious challenge questioning even of the fundamentals of liberalism, something that most of us have taken for granted for now the past 60, 70 years, which is now being questioned on multiple fronts. And so in that sense, this is perhaps the time, or the only time I've actually had available to finally try to pull it all together and bring it up to date. I should add, however, this is not my own project. This is a project that I'm working on both to finish as the executor of Hayward's literary estate, to finish this project that we started, but we didn't start it alone. In fact, I wasn't even the originator of it. My former graduate school colleague, Ijaz Gilani, was the person who came up with the idea. And in fact, it coincides with something that will probably only be studied by economic historians today, the new international economic order. That's actually how we started with it. That was the NIEO debate of the early 1970s, mid-1970s, I should say. That started this, but working with Hayward expanded it broadly. And the idea was to bring in perspectives, views, scholars writing about international relations from around the world. So Ijaz, later joined by Tahir Amin, both from Islamabad in Pakistan, and Takashi Inoguchi from University of Tokyo, were all the core members of this. And our rather immodest goal was to try to think of an approach to international relations that was at least comprehensible to different people living in different parts of the world, looking at the world from different historical traditions and understandings, to try to make a genuinely, if that's achievable, at least strive toward a genuinely global approach to the subject. There's a dialect to everything. I don't, I wouldn't, I think one can use what I call a dialectical orientation. I'm not trying to say there's a dialectical method. Maybe think of it more of an orientation, a way of thinking, a way of approaching subjects. And so any subject, I think, can lend itself to a dialectical interpretation and origin. Now, what that means, of course, it's impossible to pin down. It's rather undialectical to try to fix the meaning of a concept like dialectics. But in the second chapter of the work, we lay out 7 different core ideas that we think are essential to thinking in a dialectical or approaching world and world orders in a dialectical way.
So this is more of a reflexive approach.
Very much so. Very much so. Very reflexive, but also looking for making assumptions. Change is the norm, not the exception. Rather than trying to construct periods of stability and then trying to explain why one order breaks down and is replaced by another. No, one should just assume that change is constant and ongoing. The second sort of fundamental assumption that we work with is the idea of interpenetration. Everything is related to everything else in complex and varying ways. And then being true to, at least as an exercise, trying to think not in terms of external independent variables that are shaping or explaining change in the world, try to look at the inner sources of existing systems and the ways in which they provide a basis for their own transformation. So that's a core idea. It's not always achieved because there can be external factors that are very critically important, but to at least go through the experiment of saying, now what was the coherence of the existing system and how did the inner workings of that system produce the transformation itself? And I can give a simple example if you want from the, or maybe not so simple, but a well-known example, a really quite uncontroversial one. But looking at the 19th century balance of power system and the normal operation of that system. And it operated as, I would argue, a system of governance with a whole set of mostly informal rules and understandings. But one of the means of maintaining the balance was periodically going to war. And it was during the Great War in the first part of the 20th century, the First World War, that in fact both scholars and policy practitioners came to a recognition that that order was unsustainable. And so the inner workings of that order itself produced demand for change and transformation, which in fact resulted in what we see throughout most of the 20th century, at least, the increasing institutionalization of security at the global level. So that's just one example of looking at the internal basis of change. We started initially with the idea that we wanted to write a textbook, literally a textbook for international studies that was not parochially constrained by a particular national, regional, cultural understanding or orientation. Now that's a very, very difficult goal to accomplish, but we had that as our initial goal. Today, I suppose broader than that, because I think going beyond, because after all, students don't read textbooks anymore. So to start, as a matter of fact, I mean, there are of course some general textbooks. I think we have a little bit broader goal. We're thinking of trying to communicate to our scholarly colleagues, our colleagues around the world. And I must say, teaching as I do in Geneva, Switzerland, with a group of students that come from all over the world is in some ways the most ideal setting for this, because our conversations about any text, and of course part of our dialectical approach is to contextualize each text that we look at and try to think about where it came from, why it was written, who it was written for. In this sense, self-reflecting on our own project, I suppose one could say that we're trying to write something that would be relevant to a class of students, every student in the class coming from a different country or region of the world, so that in fact you would actually have something for a genuinely global conversation about issues. That would be the ideal audience. A practitioner audience, probably not, except in some ways the very constructivist orientation that pervades the work in terms of thinking about where theory comes from and doctrines as a fusion of theory and policy practice. I would suppose we would have goals of reaching to a much larger, more contemporary audience of practitioners as well. So not because of anything. I think if anything we've learned over the past couple of years is the imperative of scholarly engagement with the worlds of public information and public policy practice. So I think there's a greater role for getting out of our scholarly institutional bubbles and to try to relate these ideas to a much broader community globally. We were very close in 2006. We had drafted 6 of the 7 chapters of the book. We presented them all to colleagues at Oxford. We had a wonderful 3-day seminar workshop at Oxford with colleagues from all over the university commenting on the different chapters. So that is, I mean, it's a lot to try to accomplish in a 3-month visit like I have coming up here. But in fact, it was something that I've got a lot of fairly developed material to work with. There are problems of lack of consistency across the core chapters, lack of clarity in some places, and in others, it's an attempt to try to bring the manuscript up to date to communicate to contemporary issues and concerns, especially as I said earlier now that even the dominant liberal order itself is undergoing severe challenge and transformation. But it is a commitment to finish works, and then this was the final. There's one other chapter I should add, or one other paper that we wrote together, Alker Inaguchi and I, for an International Political Science Association meeting in 1985 that I may try to finish when this is finished, because my last email message from Hayward Alker described how he was working on a revision of that paper, and one of his greatest regrets was that we had never published it. So I do have a little bit of work after this manuscript, and that's a related topic. But it's the other commitment, of course, is to Ann Tickner, because every year Ann and I have dinner at the ISA, and every year she says, "When are you going to finish this book?" So this is the year. I've already sent her a note telling her I can't meet her for dinner this year at the ISA. I'm not going for once. I'm coming here to work on the book instead. So I went through 6 file drawers of material that I had gathered, accumulated, shipped various places over the course of my career. Anne had sent me papers that she had found. Some of Hayward's former students also had early manuscripts and drafts of things. I went through all of that material, hired a student to help me go through and scan all the material. And it was like going back through, it was like archival exploration. Handwritten notes from Carl Deutsch, notes from lectures of Ernie Haas, a letter from Bob Cox. I mean, these are priceless in a sense, and even a 2-page memo typed, dated 1982, from a professor at Humboldt University, GDR, on what he thought of as a dialectical approach. And I should actually put this in context. One of the reasons we introduced the whole idea of, why dialectics? Why a dialectical approach? Well, one, it of course fits the complexity of the world that Hayward always saw, lived in, participated in, constructed. But another part of it is we were, quite frankly, looking for a language that we could use to communicate with our colleagues in the former Soviet Union. And we thought that a non-Marxist, open-ended, modern synthetic dialectical approach wouldn't be exactly their conception of dialectics, but at least we would be speaking in a language that they could comprehend, rather than trying to impose behavioral, scientific, liberal, analytical, positivist social science on them. So that was really the initial impetus for doing a dialectical approach. But as I say, the D word has, it does tend to attract many detractors. I didn't bring a gift.
You started a tradition.
I did.
At Watson Institute. For all visiting scholars, they always received a Watson mug.
All right. Okay. So now I have a University of Sydney mug. Excellent.
Oh, you got to hold it to the camera.
Okay. So now I have a University of Sydney mug.